The truck he drove, the condo he bragged about on Bloor Street West, and the restaurant he told everyone he'd built from the ground up, all of it was gone before the end of that same week. And I hadn't said a single word. My son stood up in the middle of Canoe Restaurant on a Thursday evening in late October, with the CN Tower glittering behind the floor-to-ceiling windows and 40 years of Toronto's financial elite eating their lamb chops around us. And he looked at me across the table and said it loud enough that the couple at the next table went very still. "You've never taken a real risk in your life, Dad. You're the definition of a man who played it safe and ended up with nothing. Bradley," and here he gestured toward my ex-wife's partner with genuine admiration, "Bradley built something. You just watched." My ex-wife, Sandra, looked at her wine glass. Her new partner, Bradley, smiled at me the way a man smiles at a child who has just said something embarrassing at Christmas dinner. My son's wife sat perfectly still with her hands folded in her lap. I put my napkin down on the table. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked out of Canoe without ordering dessert. The elevator down to King Street was empty. The October air hit me like cold water. I didn't hail a cab. I walked east along King, past the theater district, past the old buildings I'd helped finance 30 years ago when nobody wanted to touch that part of the city. I walked until the restaurants thinned out and the street got quieter. I walked until I could think. My name is Gerald. No, wait. I've told this wrong from the start. My name doesn't matter for what I'm about to tell you. What matters is that I was 63 years old on that October night, and I had spent the better part of 4 decades doing something my son considered deeply unimpressive. I had been a very quiet, very careful, very private real estate and financial structuring consultant. I didn't have a brand. I didn't have a podcast. I didn't appear on panels at business conferences in Banff. I had a small office on Adelaide Street, a long list of clients I never discussed, and a set of numbered holding companies and family trusts that my son had never once thought to ask about. He thought he knew what I was worth. He was wrong by a number that would have made his hands shake. I got home that night to my house in Rosedale, a narrow, unremarkable Victorian that I'd bought in 1991 when everyone said Rosedale was overpriced, and I said nothing and bought it anyway, and I sat in my study without turning on any lights for a while. There's a photograph on the bookshelf of my son when he was 8 years old, standing on a construction site in a hard hat that was 3 sizes too big for his head, grinning like he'd just been handed the world. His eyes were completely uncomplicated then, full of something simple and real. I sat there in the dark and tried to remember when I'd lost him, not to anything dramatic, just to the slow accumulation of a certain kind of life, the right restaurants, the right postal code, the right friends who had the right opinions about the right things. He'd always had ambition. That was my fault, maybe. I'd never discouraged it. I just hadn't realized that somewhere in the process, ambition had curdled into something else, something that needed an audience. I didn't pour a drink. I don't drink when I need to think clearly, and that night I needed to be as clear as I'd ever been. I opened my laptop and pulled up a file I hadn't looked at in nearly 2 years. I'd named it, not very creatively, Contingency. My lawyer had helped me build it. She was the only person in my life who knew the complete picture. I opened a secure message to her and typed 7 words: "We need to meet. Tomorrow morning, bring everything." She was waiting for me at her office on Bay Street when I arrived at 8 o'clock. She handed me a coffee before I'd even taken off my coat. Black, no sugar. She'd known me long enough to know what that meant. "I saw the news," she said. She hadn't, but she knew something had happened. "Not news," I said. "Just a decision." We'd sat down at the small table by her window, not behind her desk. She'd always done that, made us equals in the room. I'd appreciated it for years without ever said so. "Walk me through it," she said. "Not the structures. I know the structures. Tell me what happened." I told her about the restaurant, about the way my son had gestured toward Bradley, about Sandra's wine glass. She listened without writing anything down. "What do you want?" she asked when I finished. "I want him to learn what he's actually standing on," I said. "Not as punishment, as education. He thinks he built something. I want him to find out who built it first." She looked at me for a long moment. "You know this is going to hurt him." "I know. But so does building your whole life on a story that isn't true and never finding out until it's too late." She nodded slowly. Then she pulled up the files. "This is the part that takes some explaining, and I want to explain it properly, because without it, the rest of this doesn't make sense. 6 years ago, my son came to me with a business plan. He wanted to open a restaurant in Toronto, not a neighborhood spot. He wanted something real, something with a reputation, maybe eventually a Michelin mention. He had the ideas, the energy, the palate. What he didn't have was money, operational experience, or any understanding of how the restaurant industry actually works financially. He asked me for a loan. He was charming about it. He made a whole presentation. I told him I couldn't help. I said my capital was tied up in retirement funds and long-term instruments. I said I thought he should try to raise money through more conventional channels, build something small first, prove the concept. He was disappointed in the way that becomes contempt very quickly in a certain kind of person. He told me I didn't understand ambition, that I'd always been too cautious, that he was going to do it without me. What I didn't tell him was that the week after he left my office, I spent 3 hours with my lawyer building a structure specifically designed to fund him without his knowledge. We created a private family trust through a holding company registered in Alberta. Legitimate, clean, straightforward. We then created a separate numbered company, NEN 47392 Ontario Inc., which we positioned as an independent hospitality investment group. We hired a retired restaurant industry consultant to serve as the face of the organization. His name appeared on the letterhead. He attended the meetings. He was entirely real. He just worked for me. My son pitched his restaurant concept to what he believed was a group of sophisticated Toronto investors who had spotted his talent. They offered him a funding commitment of $1.4 million in exchange for a 60% ownership stake and board representation. He flew back from that meeting to tell Sandra and Bradley over dinner that the investors had basically found him, that they'd come to him. He never asked why it had been so easy. He never asked who sat on that board. He opened the restaurant in Leslieville 18 months later. It did well, genuinely well. He had real talent, and I don't want to pretend otherwise. The food was good. The room was right. The reviews were strong. Within 2 years, it had a reputation. Within 4, people were talking about it in the same breath as the restaurants on the other side of town that he'd always looked up to. He hired Bradley as a business consultant 18 months in. Bradley had a background in hospitality marketing, or so he said. The retainer was $12,000 a month, billed through Bradley's numbered company. The payments were approved by my son, signed off on the restaurant's financial statements, and funded by operating capital that ultimately traced back to my trust. Bradley gave good advice on Instagram strategy and which chef collaborations to pursue. Whether that advice was worth $12,000 a month is a question I sat with for years. The answer I eventually arrived at was no. The truck was part of it too. Not a personal vehicle, a commercial truck for the restaurant's catering operation, leased through a fleet management company that handled logistics for several of my other client holdings. The lease agreement identified the restaurant as the authorized user. The actual lessor was another of my numbered companies. My son thought it was a standard commercial vehicle agreement through an independent fleet operator. He'd never looked closely at the name on the lease. He drove that truck to catering jobs and private events. He posted pictures of it on his business Instagram. He liked to say he'd built everything himself. The week after I walked out of Canoe, my lawyer and I began the unwinding. We started with the truck, a representative from the fleet company, a young man in a gray fleece jacket who looked like he drove to work from somewhere in Etobicoke, arrived at the restaurant's back entrance on a Monday morning and began the repossession process. My son came out from the kitchen, still in his apron, and tried to explain that there had been an error. The young man was polite and entirely unmoved. He had the paperwork. He had the keys. My son called the fleet company's main line and was told very calmly that the lease had been terminated by the lessor and that under Section 6 Bob of the agreement, the lessor retained the right to terminate without cause on 30 days' notice, which had in fact been given to the restaurant's administrative email address on a date approximately 5 weeks prior. My son asked who the lessor was. He was given a name. He didn't recognize it. He called me that afternoon. I didn't answer. The second thing happened 2 days later. My lawyer, acting in her capacity as representative for the trust, directed the board of the restaurant, the board that my son had never met, the board that controlled 60% of the operation, to conduct a financial review. All executive signing authority was suspended pending the audit. The corporate credit card was frozen. Non-essential vendor contracts were paused. Bradley called my son within hours of the payment freeze. I know this because my son later told me about it. Bradley's retainer had not been deposited. Bradley had several outstanding financial obligations tied to that monthly payment. The mortgage on the house he shared with Sandra, the lease on a vehicle Sandra drove. Bradley was, it turned out, not a successful hospitality consultant with a diversified client base. Bradley was a man whose entire income for the past 4 years had been a single monthly payment from a single restaurant, a restaurant whose money came from me, the man Sandra had left me for, the man my son had held up as the example of what real success looked like, the contrast against which I had been found lacking and dismissed at a dinner table in front of strangers. That man's house, that man's car, that man's lifestyle, all of it was downstream from the trust I had built and funded and managed in silence for 6 years. The third thing happened on a Thursday evening. My son came home to find a letter from the property management company that administered the restaurant's main location, a building on Queen Street East, that I had purchased 12 years ago through a numbered holding company, well before my son had expressed any interest in the restaurant industry, because the building was structurally sound and the neighborhood was about to change and the numbers made sense. The letter informed him that the lease for the restaurant's commercial space was being reviewed in light of a material change in the ownership and financial structure of the tenant business. Under Section 14 of the commercial lease, any change in beneficial ownership exceeding 40% triggered a mandatory review period, during which the landlord retained the right to reassess terms. The review would take approximately 60 days. During the review, the restaurant was permitted to continue operations, but the letter made clear that the current lease terms that were, on reflection, substantially more favorable than market rate for that location, could not be guaranteed beyond the review period. The property management company, of course, was mine. I had known when I rented that building to my son's restaurant at below market rates that I was making a choice I might someday have to reverse. I had not been glad about it. I had hoped I would never have to use it, but I had built the structure carefully because I had understood, even then, that love without boundaries is not love. It is a different thing that looks like love until the moment it stops working. He arrived at my house on a Friday night. I heard the Uber pulling up, not the truck, that was gone, and I didn't go to the door. I waited in my study. The doorbell rang twice, then a third time longer. "It's open," I called. He came down the hall the way he used to come home from school, that particular combination of needing something and resenting that he needed it. He stopped in the doorway of my study. He was in his chef's whites, still, like he'd come directly from service. There were dark circles under his eyes. "Was it you?" he said. "All of it?" I didn't answer. I turned my laptop to face him. What he saw was a document structure, clean, clearly organized. the way I do everything. The trust documents, the numbered company filings, the restaurant's ownership structure, with my trust clearly identified as the controlling shareholder through the holding company, the fleet company, the building corporation, and at the end a single page showing the history of Bradley's consulting payments, the source, the amounts, the dates, traced back to their origin. He stood there for a long time without saying anything. "The investors who came to you in Toronto," I said quietly, "the ones who believed in you before anyone else did, that was a company I created. The consultant who met with you, he worked for me. The building your restaurant is in, I bought it 12 years ago. The truck, that was a lease from another of my companies. And Bradley's retainer, every dollar of it, has been paid out of capital that originated in my family trust, which I control." He sat down, not in the good chair, on the floor, actually, against the bookcase like he used to sit when he was a teenager, and we'd have long conversations late at night when his mother was asleep. "You've been paying for everything," he said. It wasn't a question. "Since before you opened," I said. "I didn't want you to know. I wanted you to feel like you'd done it. Because you had done it, the cooking, the concept, the team, the culture of that place. That was real. What wasn't real was the story about where the money came from and who was in your corner." He looked at the photo on my shelf, the one of him in the hard hat. "Bradley," he said slowly. The words sat in the air between us. "Bradley's entire income," I said, "has been your restaurant, which has been my trust. The man your mother chose, the man you pointed to at dinner as an example of what a real risk-taker looks like. His mortgage, her car, their life in that house, all of it runs through me. The man you called a winner has been on the payroll of the man you called a failure." He put his face in his hands. I waited. Outside, a streetcar went by on the road below, the sound of it fading west. "I'm not telling you this to hurt you," I said, when enough time had passed. "I'm telling you because you stood up in a room full of people and built your self-worth on a version of your life that wasn't accurate. And I let it go on too long. That's on me, too. I should have told you years ago where the money came from. I thought I was protecting you. I think what I was actually doing was protecting the feeling of watching you succeed." He didn't say anything for a while. "What happens now?" he finally asked. "The restaurant, the building." "The review is real," I said. "The lease terms will be renegotiated to market rate. That will affect your margins significantly. The board will remain in place. Your 20% ownership hasn't changed. But the signing authority suspension will lift once the audit is complete, and you can go back to running the kitchen, which is the part you're actually good at." "And the truck?" "I don't need the truck," I said. That was a message, not a punishment. If you want a commercial vehicle for catering, your restaurant can lease one at market rate from an independent company, like any other business. He looked up at me. He looked, for the first time in a long time, like someone who was trying to figure out who I actually was. "Why?" he said. "Why did you do all of it? The trust, the numbered companies, all of it. Why not just tell me?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because you wouldn't have taken the money if you'd known it was mine," I said. "You'd already decided what I was. You needed to believe you'd gotten it somewhere else. Somewhere more impressive." I paused. "I wanted you to have the thing you wanted. I just couldn't give it to you as myself." He stayed for another 2 hours. We didn't resolve anything, exactly. Some things aren't resolved in a single conversation. But he sat in my study and we talked the way we hadn't talked in years, not about success or reputation or who was impressive, but about the restaurant, about what he actually wanted it to become, about a memory we both had of driving out to Prince Edward County one summer when he was 12 to visit a farm his mother had read about, and eating the best tomatoes either of us had ever had, standing in a field in August, and him saying he wanted to cook food that tasted like that. He still wanted that. Under everything else, he still wanted exactly that. He left before midnight. I stood on the porch and watched the Uber pull away down the quiet street. About a week later, Sandra called. I was out on my back porch with a glass of sparkling water, watching the last of the autumn leaves come down from the maple. The garden needed putting to bed for winter. I'd been looking forward to doing it. I looked at her name on the screen for 2 full rings. Then I answered. "You need to reverse this," she said before I'd spoken. Her voice was high and tight, and I could hear that she'd been crying recently. "Bradley is in a terrible position. The house, the bank has sent a notice. He has obligations, Elliot, real obligations, and you've cut off the one thing that was keeping everything running. This is petty. This is you being petty and jealous and Sandra," I said. She stopped. "I'm not going to reverse it. After everything, this isn't about you and me," I said. "It's not about Bradley. It's not about the restaurant, really. It's about our son standing up in a restaurant and telling a room full of strangers who his father was, and being wrong about it, and me deciding I was done, being the invisible foundation of a story I wasn't allowed to appear in." The line was quiet for a moment. "You should have told him," she said, more softly now. "Years ago." "Yes," I said, "I should have. That's something I have to live with. So what do we do?" "Bradley will need to find actual clients," I said. "He's not without ability. He'll be fine. The house is a separate matter between you and him." I paused. I can't keep being the solution to things I wasn't asked to be part of. She didn't have an answer to that. We said goodbye without warmth, but also without any of the old bitterness. That felt like something, at least. I put the phone down and looked at the maple. What I understood, sitting there, was something I should have understood 30 years earlier. There is a difference between providing for someone and building a foundation they can actually feel and stand on. I had been very good at the first thing. I had mistaken it for the second. My son had grown up with every material advantage I could quietly engineer and almost no sense of where it came from or what it cost. That wasn't generosity. That was something more complicated. Something I'd told myself was love, but was also, I can admit now, a need to feel necessary without ever having to explain myself or ask for anything in return. That version of fatherhood had run its course. The audit completed in December. The board met, virtually, with my son attending for the first time, actually meeting the board his restaurant had operated under for 6 years. The experience was visibly strange for him. He was polite and focused and asked good questions about the financial structure going forward. Afterward, he called me and said it had been a lot to take in. I agreed. By January, the lease was renegotiated to market terms. It was harder on the margins than before. He made adjustments. He let one catering contract go, renegotiated his supplier relationships, moved the menu slightly upscale to support better margins per cover. The restaurant stayed open. The reviews continued to be good. In February, on a Sunday afternoon, he drove out to Rosedale in his own car, a used Subaru he'd bought privately, and knocked on my door. I made tea. We sat in the kitchen for 2 hours. He told me about the winter service, about a new sous chef he'd hired, about a private event he was planning for the spring. He asked me questions, real questions, about how the trust structures worked and what my role on the board actually looked like going forward. He listened to the answers. Before he left, he stood in the front hallway and looked at me for a moment without saying anything. "I didn't know what you'd built," he said finally. "Any of it. I thought I had it figured out. Who was successful, who wasn't, who had done something real." He paused. "I was wrong about you. I didn't need him to say more than that. Maybe I didn't even need to hear it, though I'd be lying if I said it didn't matter. Make food that tastes like those tomatoes," I said. He almost smiled. Then he nodded and opened the door and walked back out into the February cold. I watched him go. Then I went back to my study, sat down in my old chair, and looked at the photograph on the shelf. My son at 8 years old, the oversized hard hat, the uncomplicated grin. I left it where it was. Some foundations don't need to be hidden. They just need to be built right, so that when the test comes, they hold.